Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Now, as mentioned last week, this week, today, in fact, if you're watching this on Wednesday, is International Women's Day. To hear about why that's ironic, check back to last week's episode. To set our focus on some incredible women you likely have never heard of, stay with us for this revolutionary rundown. So, part of our jobs as activists is to remember and analyze the past so that we may learn from the mistakes and the triumphs, but also so that we can lift up the memory of those the system hopes to erase. To pick up where all of our schools and our histories or his stories failed, where the veils of patriarchy, misogyny, and the sidekicks of racism, colonialism, and capitalism have covered the efforts and achievements of women in everything, from science to social justice. Indeed, our job as women activists and men or non-binary allies is to pull the veil back, to uncover the work of these women so that we can not only be inspired by them, but so that we may learn from their struggles and apply that knowledge to our battles today. Now, alas, this is but a microscopic and very brief sampling, but this list might serve as an introduction, one that you can and should build upon. So in no particular order, let's start with Qi Jin, feminist, revolutionary, and writer in late 19th, early 20th century China. Not satisfied to live as a quiet housewife, Jin left China and her family in her 20s to study in Japan, adopting male clothing and a nickname meaning challenger of men. She joined several radical groups working to overthrow the Qing dynasty, and wrote extensively on the role of women in both the political and intellectual spheres, becoming a feminist in a hyper-male-dominated place and time. Upon her return to China after being expelled from Japan, she ran a secret military training academy before ultimately being found out and executed by the government, due in no small part to her stubborn refusal to remain silent or covert in her political and social opinions. Berta Cáceres, an indigenous Honduran environmental activist and co-founder of the Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras, or COPIN. This organization, under Cáceres' guidance, battled a series of dirty and destructive energy projects, including the world's largest dam builder, Sino Hydro, who in 2013 withdrew a proposed project due to COPIN's unwavering pressure. Despite many threats of murder and violence, she persisted, knowing full well that her life was on the line as she fought for planet and people. And last March, she was assassinated. Her government's fingerprints, and thereby our government's, thanks in no small part to Hillary Clinton, are all over her murder. Rojava, an incredible woman of whom there is no individual picture. She led hundreds of Igbo women in revolt in the late 1920s Nigeria in what is now called the Igbo Women's War, and it all began with a sit-in. Rojava organized a group of women to stage what was called Sitting on a Man against Warrant Chief Okugo, an openly tyrannical tool of the British government who had oppressed one too many, one too often for her to accept. Okugo's response to the peaceful sit-in, which included singing and dancing outside of his house, was to drive a spear through one of the women's feet, shoot a pregnant woman with an arrow, and set his own house on fire in order to blame the women for it. The protests then spread. Anger over the new taxes, but even more so the British colonial government and their appointed warrant chiefs, inspired women to take to the streets. And yet still, officials ignored them. So they took it up a notch. They attacked European stores, banks, and courts, knocked down telegraph poles, and cut wires. They did not, however, hurt anyone. And that's important to note because the British response was to open fire and kill more than 50 women and set fire to whole villages. In the end, the colonial authorities did ditch their plans for new taxes and curtailed the power of the warrant chiefs. What's known as the Igbo Women's War was one of the first large-scale and partially successful challenges to British rule in West Africa. Excuse me. Since we're on the subject of breaking shit and not hurting anyone, Emmeline Pankhurst, a British woman who proudly called herself a hooligan, Pankhurst was the black bloc wing of the suffragette movement in England in the early 1900s. Having seen no advancement in women's rights after years of peaceful pandering and calm protests, she organized a militant group of women to, among other things, break windows, bomb houses, burn a train station, cut phone wires, throw rocks at the crown jewels, and toss a hatchet into the Prime Minister's carriage, all without injuring anyone, and all to get the right to vote. She was arrested several dozens of times, but was always released after 1 to 2 days due to her staunch refusal to eat, drink, or sit down. Throughout the course of the British suffragette movement, women were jailed and tortured regardless of the actions they took, peaceful or no. Which is another reason that Pankhurst saw no reason to remain docile. In 1918, women in Britain over the age of 30 were given the right to vote. Unfortunately, she died 1 month before the vote was extended to all women over 21 years later. Phulan Devi, known as the Bandit Queen, was born to one of the lowest castes in India, an untouchable, as they call it. At age 11, she was married off to a 33-year-old man who beat and raped her, so she left. Which sounds fair to you and me, but for that place and time, that was absolutely unthinkable. After walking the width of Texas to get back home, having her family suggest an honorable suicide, going to the police for help, getting gang raped, and becoming branded as a sex worker, she was kidnapped at the behest of her cousin, who had in fact stolen her family's land. Interestingly enough, she became good friends with the second in command of her kidnappers and joined the band in robbing trains, kidnapping, ransoming, and other bandity things. She also got a hold of her oppressors, beating her ex-husband and mutilating his genitals, killing the cop who had spread the rumor of her being a sex worker. Over the course of the next few years, she would be kidnapped by rival bandits, gang raped again, and ultimately once again amass a small army to destroy her oppressors. Fast forward to 1996, after laying down her arms in 1983 and serving jail time, she ran for and won a seat in the Indian Parliament, dedicating her life to fighting for the oppressed. She was assassinated in 2001, supposedly as revenge for the Behme massacre, where she murdered 22 men responsible for her last kidnapping, rape, and the murder of her lover, the second in command of her bandit gang. Sylvia Rivera, an LGBTQIA activist who was one of the leading forces behind the Stonewall Rebellion, the event most widely considered to be the birth of the LGBTQIA rights movement in the U.S. Together with her friend Marsha P. Johnson, she founded the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR, an organization that provided food, shelter, and guidance to young drag queens, trans kids, and other members of the LGBTQI community in New York City. She is also a founding member of the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activist Alliance. While she went by Sylvia, she spoke of gender without any absolutes, calling herself at times a gay man, a gay girl, a drag queen, and a street queen. In this way, she was also at the forefront of a now growing understanding of gender fluidity and non-binary identity. The Night Witches, or the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, Russian female pilots during the Second World War who battered the Nazis on the Eastern Front via wooden planes. Yes, wooden planes. Using makeshift planes that had been set aside for crop dusting or destruction even, the Night Witches, led by Marina Raskova, dropped bombs on the Germans every single night for 3 years, without the use of any armor, guns, sights, radio, cockpit, brakes, parachutes, or any navigation machinery. Again, wooden fucking planes. They earned their name due to the fact that they had to turn off their engines when flying overhead of the Nazis, because the engines were so loud that they wouldn't effectively surprise the enemy if they left them on. The resulting whoosh overhead just before the bomb drop is how they became known as Nachthexen, or Night Witches. Despite these ridiculous planes, intense and truncated trainings, 14-hour days, and little to no support from the male-dominated military, of the 200 night witches that flew during the war, only 32 were lost. Josephine Baker, a woman who never chose between activism and entertainment. Baker was an American expat who made a home in France and a career worldwide as a singer, actress, and dancer. During the Second World War, she used her role as an entertainer to funnel information to the Allies, becoming a valuable spy for the resistance. After the war, she shifted her activism towards the civil rights movement, working closely with the NAACP and Martin Luther King Jr. She adopted children from a variety of backgrounds, calling them her Rainbow Tribe, further challenging social norms for both race and gender. Throughout her career, Baker's performances also challenged not only racist stereotypes of what blacks should and could do, but also what women should and could do, infusing cabaret numbers with slapstick comedy routines and varied dance styles. The Rojava Revolution in Syria. The Committee of Diplomacy of Congrea Star is a congregation of women's organizations in Rojava, Syria, that released a 33-page report on their work in 2005. The overarching message was simple. Without the liberation of women, a truly free society is impossible. The report outlines how this predominantly Kurdish women-led movement is doing more than just surviving in a war zone. They're thriving and building an egalitarian society while protecting each other and resisting the Islamic State. Their work seeks to also dismantle the patriarchal hold on knowledge and education by teaching women's rights as well as self-defense and women's history. Assemblies and communes meet frequently to further discuss and propagate information and studies, as well as deal with everyday items such as the distribution of energy and water. Now again, this list is but a really tiny, minuscule example of badass revolutionary women throughout the ages. So much of our legacy as strong women has been erased, covered up by insecure and scared men, covered up by hate and greed, colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and in many cases, complicity. On this International Women's Day, instead of just posting some selfie with a hashtag heart emoji women or some shit like that, why don't you find out about a revolutionary woman who fought for justice, who fought for freedom? Then take something from that and fold that into who you are. Regardless of whether you're male, female, or somewhere else on that spectrum, we can all learn and grow from the power of the women who marched before us.